Who and what are you?
I'm a carbon-based life form on the planet Earth. My name is Richard Brown. I'm currently employed as assistant professor of philosophy at LaGuardia Community College, which is part of the City University of New York.
And your research interests?
I'm interested in philosophy of mind and cognitive science, especially naturalistic theories of consciousness.
Cool. And I'm Pete Mandik. I'm associate professor of philosophy at William Patterson University in New Jersey. I work primarily in philosophy of mind and philosophy of neuroscience, and more specifically in areas of mental representation and consciousness. That's me.
All right, good. So that's us. So I figured we'd go ahead and begin perhaps by trying to motivate the higher order approach to consciousness. Why would a person be attracted to this kind of view?
Yeah, I think that sounds terrific. Do you want to launch into something there?
Yeah, I could go ahead and launch in. So,
That'd be cool.
primarily, it seems to me that higher order theories are useful for responding to conceptual arguments, which try to show that consciousness can't, in some principled way, be explained naturalistically or shown to ultimately be physical. So often these kinds of arguments, the zombie argument, the Mary argument, Kripke's modal argument, various arguments of this sort, what they try to show is that well, we can conceive of physical duplicates of ourselves that lack any kind of conscious mental life, and so that's supposed to be a telling point against any kind of physicalist account. So it seems to me that a good strategy for answering that is to assert the conceivability of physical creatures that have consciousness in just the same way that we, in fact, do have consciousness. So I've called these kinds of things zombies in some of my work. Keith Frankish has called these anti-zombies, and Katie Baylog has called them Illuminati. But the basic idea
Yeah.
is similar between the three of us, that it's perfectly conceivable that there be physical duplicates of us that are conscious in just the same way that ordinary, everyday people on Earth are. And so I like to take that a little bit further and say, well, not only is this conceivable in the sense that there's no obvious contradiction in imagining or conceiving that consciousness is physical, but even further, I think that we can positively conceive of a scenario in which there are physical duplicates of us that have no non-physical properties and yet are conscious in just the same way we are. And the higher order thought theory is, in my view, one way of doing that. So it gives us an account in naturalistic terms of what qualitative consciousness could be. And so in my view, it's not even really important that it turn out that it's actually true. I'm more interested in merely saying that it could be true, that it's a
Yeah.
possibility, it hasn't been refuted. And so that's really, to me, where the action is. It really shows us a way in which we could plausibly see consciousness as a physical, non-mysterious part of the world.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point, and I'd like to just follow up on that quickly. So this idea that one of the great things about the higher order thought approach to explaining consciousness is that it gives a very plausible, possible explanation of consciousness. When people talk about the problem of whether you can give an explanation of consciousness, sometimes things that get trotted out are like, the 40 hertz hypothesis. If you've got
Right.
uh,
Hmm.
neural processes vibrating in synchrony at uh, a certain rate, that's consciousness, or consciousness is the collapse of the quantum wave function microtubules. Those aren't
Right.
even recognizable as explanations. You start off with this one thing, consciousness, and then you make this huge leap to something that's completely different, like microtubules. Where with the higher order thought uh, attempt to explain consciousness, you take the target phenomenon, which is consciousness, and you relate it to other things that are pretty clearly mental, things like
Hmm.
thought and experience, and it's recognizable as like it is a starter, and
Right.
a lot of discussions about the explanatory gap. Um, they just start off with this unanalyzed notion of consciousness, like consciousness is what it's like, and if you have to ask what does that mean, then you'll never know, and the kind of the stuff.
Right.
And once you become familiar with the basic ideas of the higher order thought theory of consciousness and the way it relates consciousness to things like thought and representation, you start to see that I mean it's not obvious that it has to be this simple, unanalyzable thing. It's a very
Right.
plausible, possible explanation, in part because it relates consciousness to other recognizable mental phenomena that aren't
Right.
themselves necessarily conscious. So you've got the
Right.
hope of a non-circular explanation.
Yeah, I agree. In fact, I think that's a pretty important point that you're bringing up there. So, to me, it's a lot of what are theories of consciousness that are so-called neurophilosophical theories of consciousness. Not all of them, but a lot of them, I think, are pitched at the wrong level of explanation. If what you're interested in,
Yeah,
that is really an explanation of what consciousness is, rather than an implementation. So it seems to me that you've got to have some pre-theoretic notion of what you're looking for in the data, uh, in order to make sense or
right.
explain why that particular phenomenon is important, for consciousness.
Yeah, I think I can agree with a lot of that, even though I might be a little bit more optimistic than you about the merits of a neurophilosophical account of
Mm.
consciousness. And
Right.
if I got to also add that this pre-theoretic account might be revisable as
Right.
a card-carrying Quinian. I like revisability. Then,
Right.
yeah, I could totally agree with that. That we need to start with something. Need to start somewhere, and maybe we will revise that starting place as we develop the theory further. But you've got to
That's
start
right.
somewhere. You can't just leap and say, "Oh yeah, consciousness is this weird thing," and so maybe it's quantum stuff in your microtubules.
That's right. I mean, and so I also think it's important that we have this revisability statement. So, for instance, speaking from the higher order perspective, one of the things that's going to have to be revised is our pre-theoretic belief, that there are qualitative states that occur unconsciously. So it seems that to be part of common sense that if you have a pain, it's always painful. And it's a prediction of the higher order theory that there are pains which aren't painful
Right.
for the person in which they occur. So and that's a bitter pill to a bitter pill to swallow for some
Yeah.
people because of their allegiance to this pre-theoretic intuition that pains have to be painful at all times, or else
Yeah.
what are we talking about? So I mean, we can talk about that maybe later in the discussion, because that's, I
Yeah.
think, a central battleground, on which higher order theories will fall or prevail.
Well, it
So,
occurs to me that we should probably say some more right now about what the higher order thought theory of consciousness is, like what the basic features of it are. Do you want to take a
okay.
crack at that?
I could, yeah. I mean, I'd be happy to let you take a crack at it too, if you were.
Um, okay, I'll take a crack at it.
Yeah,
You
why
can
don't you go ahead and I'll
jump, you
chime
jump
in.
in when I make mistakes. So the way I think of the higher order thought theory of consciousness is it starts off by calling attention to different aspects of consciousness or different ways in which you might use words like conscious and consciousness. And two very important senses of consciousness. One has to do with state consciousness. So we have various mental states like beliefs and desires and experiences, and state consciousness has to do with a property of those states. And
Right.
some of those states are conscious, and some of those aren't conscious. Now, another sense of the word conscious or use of the word conscious that's important to the higher order thought theory is the idea of being conscious of something, and this is what gets
Right.
referred to as transitive consciousness.
Right.
So, I'm conscious of the way I look on the computer monitor. Not really happy with that either. But anyway, so I'm conscious of various things that I perceive, and perhaps even things that I think about. Perhaps in virtue of thinking about you, I'm conscious of you. Um,
Mhm.
So then the next move is to identify state consciousness as the target of what needs to be explained, and to try to explain it in terms of transitive consciousness. So the next move then is to say that a conscious state is a state that you are conscious of. So what's happening here is that state consciousness is initially being explained or illuminated in terms of transitive consciousness. And the higher order thought advocates say that this is something that's enshrined in common sense. This is part of the way the folk think of consciousness, that a conscious mental state is a state that you are conscious of. There are slightly different ways of putting that, and maybe we can get to that later. And now there might be a little bit of a worry of circularity here if you want to explain consciousness and the explanation keeps using the word consciousness. You haven't really given a full explanation. And the higher order thought people are very alive to that sort of worry, and they have a very good answer to it. And they say that transitive consciousness can be explained in terms of thinking. So what it means to be conscious of something is to have a thought about it or a thought of it. And more broadly, they might say something like to be conscious of something is to have a mental state that represents that. And so this gives you variations of the higher order approach, where some theorists might say it's not so much thoughts that matter, but a kind of higher order perception. You're conscious of something by perceiving it instead of thinking about it. And mostly what we're going to be talking about today is the higher order thought approach. So I guess I'll stick with that. So anyway,
I'll just chime in for a second, just and point out really briefly. That's why, for instance, some people have stopped using the word conscious there. And so, for instance, I think Ned Block just uses the word awareness. And I'm pretty sure people like David Rosenthal are okay with the substitution of awareness for conscious there. And then it's quite obvious that there's no circularity involved, because what you're saying is that state consciousness involves an awareness of yourself as being in those states. So, I mean, they really are separate phenomena, I guess, which happen to be named by the same term in our language, which is accidental. So there's no, you're right, there's no circularity. But it's strange to me how common this assertion is, that there's
the circularity. I think I don't think that's a problem. Now, in the neighborhood is this weird problem. So if state consciousness and transitive consciousness are separable in this way, then you can have states in virtue of which you're conscious of something, but the states themselves aren't conscious. And this is no objection, but that sounds weird to a lot of people, that I could be unconsciously conscious of something. So I can be unconsciously... if you think about like the autopilot case, a lot of people want to describe the long-distance truck driver who has mentally gone on autopilot, and they want to describe that as a case in which they were unconscious for some duration of the trip, but they were still driving. They were responding appropriately to turns in the road and changes of lights. So it looks like they were unconsciously conscious of the turns in the road and the changes in the lights.
That's right.
So maybe people that are pushing the circularity worry are worried about that kind of thing.
That's possible, I guess. I mean, there's just two different senses of the word conscious being employed in that sentence there. So it's more of an ambiguity issue. So I mean, he's conscious of the road in the sense that he has representations of the road which guide his behavior. So transitive consciousness really is a matter of being informationally responsive to the environment. So that when you represent the objects out there, you're able to use those representations to guide your behavior. You're conscious. We simply say you're conscious of the stuff that's there. So that will allow for cases like subliminal perception, where you present a stimulus that's under threshold, so the person denies that they see anything, but yet it, for instance, will prime a later response, so it's having effects.
Yeah.
So we say that you unconsciously perceived the stimulus, and it does, I guess, grate a bit if on common sense if you say it in that way. But
Right.
I think it's part of our ordinary experience that, at least since Freud, right, that part of common sense is that we can have beliefs and desires which operate at an unconscious level and
Yeah.
of which we are unaware.
Right.
And I think it is also part of common sense that we don't call those states conscious. At least it's most obvious, in my view, it's most obvious in the case of beliefs and desires and other propositional attitudes.
Yeah.
When you say, oh, yeah, I wasn't aware that I believed that, and there's no temptation to say that it was a conscious belief.
Yeah.
The resistance starts to come a bit more when you talk about perceptual states, and then I think you need a separate argument that perceptual states work the same way that propositional attitudes do. And I think that argument can be given, but it's still a further issue.
This reminds me, I was just recently reading a science fiction novel in which some aliens had been discovered, and they had scanned their brains and somehow convinced themselves, the humans had convinced themselves that these aliens had representations of their representations. And so they concluded that they must have been conscious.
Interesting.
So there you go.
It was written by a higher order theorist.
Well, you know, I guess it was an appendix of the book, or maybe in the foreword or something like that. He does mention Dennett. I believe he said he got some of his ideas from Consciousness Explained. So, and Dennett does talk about the higher order thought theory in Consciousness Explained. So anyway, I don't know if it's...
Well, actually, you know, I just follow up on that really quickly, if you don't mind, Pete.
Oh, that's fine.
So Dennett is famous for his first-person operationalism, and that kind of view has a lot in common with the higher order thought theory.
Right.
The main difference, of course, is over whether or not there are first order states that you can accurately or inaccurately represent. And so the higher order approach says, in addition to all this self-interpretation, which is the first person operationalism stuff, in addition to that, there's also the first order states which you can accurately interpret or inaccurately interpret. So it's not that far of a jump just from sort of thinking about Dennett's own work, but then factoring in some common sense about psychological reality and ending up with something like a higher order view.
Yeah. And now this issue about accuracy, especially accuracy of higher order thoughts, really gets us into the heart of some of what many philosophers think is most problematic about the higher order thought theory.
Right.
And perhaps now would be a good time to talk about the problem of empty higher order thoughts.
Yeah, actually, if I could we put that off for just a second and go back to a thread that we had left off a second ago? So earlier you were in the midst of giving this very nice sort of unpacking of the various senses of the word conscious and explaining how those relate to the higher order approach, and that was all very good, but then we got a little bit sidetracked. So I want to make sure we finished that before we went on. So you were talking about transitive consciousness and state consciousness and the explanation of those, of one in terms of the other. And then, of course, finally, the brass ring in this discussion is phenomenal consciousness. And so I don't want to move on to these other issues before we sort of say something about that.
Very good. Yeah.
So would you like to continue? Because you were doing a great job, or I can take up at this point if it's either way.
You know, this, I'll say a little bit more about it. So phenomenal consciousness is, well, it's a funny sort of thing. And it doesn't have a very clear role in this taxonomy of state consciousness and transitive consciousness. And you know, one person who's, I think, written some pretty nice things about this is Austin Clarke. So Austin is he likes this division of consciousness into state consciousness and transitive consciousness, and addresses the question of, well, what about so-called phenomenal consciousness? And his conclusion is that there really is no such thing. That it's a weird kind of philosophical term of art, and if we think about, if we think about the way the word conscious and consciousness is used,
Hmm.
whatever phenomenal consciousness is supposed to be, it looks like it's just, at best, it's state consciousness after all. Um, and so one kind of thing that you might think about phenomenal consciousness is that there's nothing there to give a theory of, as long as you've got a theory of state consciousness and transitive consciousness, you are good to go. Now,
Right.
to say some things in favor of phenomenal consciousness, you might think that, yeah, sure, it's a philosophical term of art, that two-word phrase, phenomenal consciousness, but nonetheless, there's something there that most people know what you're talking about, and it has something to do with what it's like to have certain kinds of mental states, specifically
Right.
sensory experiences. So what it's like to see something that's blue is more like seeing something that's purple than seeing something that's orange, or what it's like to have an experience of a lemon. To taste a lemon is more like tasting a lime than tasting chocolate.
Hmm.
People get what you mean when you say things like, well, uh, probably someone who was blind from birth wouldn't know what it's like to see red,
Right.
and no amount of description, no amount of book knowledge would convey to them what it's like to see red. I'm not
Yes.
endorsing that view,
Right. No, I know
but
you
people
aren't.
understand what you're talking about.
That's right. Yeah.
And so phenomenal consciousness, yeah, perhaps it's a term of art, but it denotes something. And one way you might put it is it's that property of mental states, uh, in virtue of which there's something it's like to be in them. And
Right.
so maybe this is something that goes along with state consciousness, that when you have a conscious state, there's also something that it's like. Um,
Right.
do
Or
you want to
maybe it
say some more
isn't.
about phenomenal consciousness and
Yeah,
how?
I would, because I
Uh,
take a slightly, I guess, different take on it than the take that you're taking on it. So for me, I'm a qualifier from the old school in the sense
oh
that
no,
yeah, so I think that the qualitative aspects of our experience are the central, most present part of our life, and that it's something verging on absurd to deny that there's something there that needs to be explained. So that first kind of strategy that you mentioned, where someone says, "Oh, well, maybe there's nothing to be explained," that to me is shocking and incensing to me. And in fact, I remember as an undergraduate first reading Dennett's Quine and Qualia, and just being livid that there could be a person who denied the manifest obviousness
man,
of the
I love
data.
that
And so,
paper.
sorry.
I said I love that paper. One of my
Yeah,
all-time
right.
favorite papers.
It's a good paper. I mean, it serves its point of getting you to think carefully about these issues. But nonetheless, so at the time I was sort of very much in line with the Searles of the world, who I heard once famously quip. He said, "What am I supposed to do? Pinch myself and publish the results in the Journal of Philosophy in order to sort of get people to know what we're talking about here, and that this isn't enough." So I think that we've got to start with, I don't know. So is phenomenal consciousness a term of art? Well, sure it is, but is the thing which we have access to in our experience a term of art or some theoretical posit? I deny that it is, and it sounds a bit suspicious to claim that it is on my part. So I would go further than you would, and not only do people know what you're talking about when you say that red is more like orange than it is like purple, etc., but they also eventually come to understand what you mean when you talk about invert cases. So
Oh,
at
inverted
first
qualia.
yeah, that's right. And so at
Yeah.
first it's very strange to them well, your green is my red or something like that, and they don't quite see it. But eventually they come to realize, oh yeah, it could be like that because we have these private things which we identify in a first person kind of way. Um, Later you can make the same kind of sense out of the Mary and zombie cases. And again, I am the last person who's going to think that zombies are really conceivable. In fact, I've spent some time arguing that they're not really conceivable,
Right.
but they certainly seem to be conceivable to the average person first coming to this. And I think, when you take your intro class and you meet Descartes and you're introduced to the Cartesian process of doubting, and you get to the end where you're at the point where you're saying, oh, well, I could be a disembodied mind. It
Right.
seems to make sense, and we know what
Yeah.
we're talking about. The fact that we can't define it isn't embarrassing because, well, you can't define much of it, of anything, as it turns out. And so what we can do is say, well, you know what we're talking about because you have it too.
Yeah.
So so state consciousness is important, and I agree that that's a noble goal of a theory of consciousness. But the most important part of consciousness, at least for someone like me,
Yeah.
is phenomenal consciousness. And so it's then a further claim that the higher order theory or the transitivity principle can shed any light on phenomenal consciousness at all. And so
Right.
I think that it can, but you need separate arguments, and then you need a separate step,
Yeah.
in my view, to go from the commonplace claim, sure, a conscious state is one that I'm aware of, to the more substantive claim, oh, and by the way, that's all there is to phenomenal consciousness.
Well, maybe before we get to the empty higher thought problem, we should talk a bit more about the way many have interpreted the higher thought account as accommodating phenomenal consciousness. Does that sound good?
Yeah, absolutely. I could rehearse the what I take to be the main argument for this, if you.
Oh, the argument for how you fit phenomenal consciousness into higher thought theory?
Yeah.
Yeah, go for it. That sounds good.
And it's basically just rehearsing an argument that David Rosenthal has given in a lot of different places, which I think is quite good. So you start with just pointing out that people are able to come to discriminate qualities in their experiences which they weren't able to do before. So, for instance, the famous case of this is the wine taster, but any kind of skill like that where you come to appreciate finer aspects of your experience. So, for instance, for me, it's Scotch. I would prefer Scotch tasting, but the idea is the same. You have a first order state from the hypothesis that represents, in a way which we can discuss later if we ever get to that, the qualities that are in the actual thing that you're tasting. But you can be more or less aware of that first order state. In other words, you can have finer or coarser grained higher order thoughts. So for instance, if you come to learn the word oaky, then now your experience of the wine changes in that now there's oakiness there. There's a new aspect of the phenomenology. And the important thing to note, that Rosenthal is fond of pointing out, is that this happens just by learning the word. So you come to have a word, plausibly that would simply allow you to have concepts. And so the most plausible explanation of how it could be possible that learning a word changes your experience is that you employ a concept in a higher order thought. So that at least opens the realm of possibilities up for someone like me or David Rosenthal to go on and say, well, it's having these concepts which is doing the work of making it like that for you. Now, you can tell other stories, so I think a sort of kind of a thought experiment about extracting concepts away so that you sort of become aware of your first order state in a more and more generic way. So if you didn't have the concept of oakiness, then your phenomenology would lack the oakiness which is associated with that. So extracting that concept removes that part of the phenomenology. If you didn't have the concept of tannin, then it wouldn't be tannin-like. If you didn't have the concept of Merlot or Pinot Noir, then that aspect of the experience would be gone. If you didn't even have the concept of white versus white wines, then you would just have some kind of generic wine experience. And I think if you sort of think about going through this process, you get to the point where what would you do if you extracted the final concept so that you were just aware of the first order state in some generic way as a taste experience? Mm-hmm. I mean, you take that away so that you're no longer aware of it in any way at all. It seems plausible, not obvious, but plausible that, well, it would be no longer the case that there was something that it was like for you to have that first order state. And if that's the case, then it's not a stretch to make the further claim that it's having the higher order thoughts there with their relevant and appropriate concepts in the right way that accounts for the phenomenology altogether. Now, I agree that's contestable and that there are other interpretations of how learning these concepts comes to change your experience. I agree. It changes the first order state. I agree that.
Yeah, I wanted to ask a question about that.
Okay, yeah, go ahead.
Right, so I'm pretty friendly to the suggestion that concepts can play a very important role in what it's like to have certain perceptual experiences, and that, I've been wondering, why isn't it just a first order application of the concept? So to go back to your Scotch tasting example, I acquire the concept of oakiness, and also what goes along with that is an ability to apply that concept when I taste some Scotch. Why isn't it just a first order conceptual representation of the Scotch as being oaky that constitutes what it's like?
It very well could be. I think that's a viable alternative hypothesis. So this is my own personal view. I mean, I don't think, for instance, I'm not speaking ex-Rosenthal-y right now. So, I mean, I'm sort of interpreting the view in my own way and not saying something I think is officially the standard view here. But I think that going back to our first part of the conversation, the mere fact that the way I describe things is a possibility is enough to do the work that I want it to do, which is that here's one way which plausibly could be the case, and phenomenology would be a natural property of the higher thought. Now, maybe the way that you presented it is another way that it could go. So I think actually that would be an empirical issue, which you might be able to test to see, for instance, whether or not there are various states in the parts of the brain that we think are first order states, and whether they couple with certain states that we think, say, for instance, dorsal prefrontal cortex and things of that nature. So I think that you could actually get in there and see, well, what's going on? What kinds of concepts are you tokening, and what work are they doing? Now, obviously, that's theoretically in the future, but I ultimately, the point is that it's an empirical point, I think, actually, which of these interpretations is right.
Yeah. Fair enough.
Okay, so you'd be satisfied with that answer?
Yeah. I think that will satisfy me for now.
But so before we move on, I will just say, though, that it's definitely, you're right, though, that for a person like Rosenthal, he often presents this argument as though this is the only possible interpretation of that data, and anyone who denies that is somehow not appreciating the point in the right way. And so I think that's a bit too strong. Maybe I'm missing something, I'm not sure, but it seems to me that these other accounts in terms of the first order states aren't ruled out on any a priori basis, or there's no obvious objection, right? Except an empirical one, that's not the way the brain works or something like that, right? Or that's not the right theory of consciousness or something.
The way I tend to think of this, and I don't know to what degree any higher thought advocates would endorse this, but I tend to think of this in terms of knowledge and also appearance. So, so if we were to compare two situations, both of which were similar with respect to what the higher order thought was, like, so the higher thought was, I'm having an experience of something being blue, and the situations that overlap with respect to the higher order thought, but differ with respect to whether it's true or not.
Yes.
Right. So you're not, in one situation you are having a first order experience of something being blue, and in the second one, say, a first order experience of something being red. And now if we ask ourselves questions like, well, would you know which situation you were in? Or to move from knowledge to just appearance, you ask, well, how would it appear to you? What would it seem? How would it seem to you that your mental life was at that moment? And it seems, I don't know if this counts as an argument or just, an appeal to intuition, but it seems to me that in both cases, like, it's the higher thought that's carrying the load.
Right.
If there's a very close connection between thinking and knowledge on a lot of accounts. Thoughts are very much like beliefs, and a lot of people hold that belief is an analytical component of knowledge.
Right.
I'm happy with that sort of thing. Right, if your higher order thought was the same in each case, and the only difference was something outside of that, then you wouldn't know. You would be in no position to know that there was a difference.
That's right.
And I'm
well. Let me just stop you. That's a bit strong. So you would be in no position to know from the first person. So there would be no introspective way that you could know, but you could certainly gather some evidence from the third person. Like, for instance, you could notice your own behavior, or you could have an autocerebroscope or some kind of nonsense like that, where you're like, aha, I'm actually in the first order red state. That's interesting. I'm having a conscious blue experience. I must have a mismatch. So I think you could come to know, but you're right. You couldn't come to know from the first person point of view, or in other words, there would be no difference in your conscious experience.
Yeah, right.
But there would be a difference in your mental life and your mental functioning, just not in your conscious experience.
Fair enough. I mean, we could devise a different case, one in which we're not just holding the higher thoughts constant, but we're holding all the thoughts constant.
Right.
And we just change things outside of thought. You wouldn't, as long as your thoughts were the same in each case, then you wouldn't know which case you're in.
Right. That's right.
It's kind of like a Cartesian skeptical hypothesis, where with the way the Cartesian runs it, we keep everything inside the mind fixed, and then we talk about how you wouldn't know the difference between an external world that conformed to the internal representation and one that didn't. And so it's a similar sort of move, but what we're keeping fixed is a portion of the mind. We're keeping the thought portion fixed, and then we're changing things that are outside of that, but may nonetheless be internal to the mind.
Right.
And I follow the Cartesian-ish intuition that you wouldn't know which situation you're in, and we could put a similar point in terms of appearance, the way things seem to you. It would seem to you to be the same. Now, of course, this is controversial. If people wanted, they could push the suggestion that maybe there's a kind of knowledge that lives in the experiences themselves, outside of thought. Similarly, there's a kind of appearance besides the appearance that goes along with thought. So, that's philosophy for you.
Yeah, that's right.
Everyone disagrees with something.
And I will just add on finally too that you can come at it from the other end, so to speak. So think about what the other side has to say. What they have to say is that, for instance, if you have a pain, and this pain occurs unconsciously in the sense that you are no way aware of yourself as being in this pain, then what these people have to say is that pain feels a certain way all by itself, just sitting there. And it doesn't seem to me that you can really make sense out of that notion, because the idea that it feels a certain way entails that it feels a certain way for someone. So it doesn't. I mean, maybe this is just a personal shortcoming, but I just can't make any sense out of the idea that it feels a certain way, but nobody knows about it.
Yeah.
So therefore, I'm pushed towards the idea that the theoretical posit that when you have these unconscious pains, there's simply nothing that it's like for you. Yeah. And my own experience seems to bear that out. When I've had pains, which I was completely unaware of, from my point of view, it was as though I did not have the pain. And then suddenly when I become aware of the pain, it's painful for me. So I think that even though there's this intuitive resistance to the idea that there's unconscious sensations which don't have any phenomenal feel for the person. Now, parentheses, that doesn't mean they don't have qualitative properties which differentiate them from other sensory states, etc., etc. But they just don't have any, there's no, as far as consciousness is concerned, they just aren't there. And I think that so all of these various avenues give support to the idea that the higher order theory is not obviously false, especially about phenomenal consciousness. It's not obviously true. You need to do a lot of work in thinking about these kinds of examples like we have been doing, and there are objections to it, obviously, as with every theory. But it's on the table as something which needs to be taken seriously. As far as naturalistic theories go. And I think often people sort of dismiss it. And it's interesting, I can draw an analogy to something that Uriah Kriegel has said elsewhere about the explanatory gap. So Kriegel has argued that, well, the reason that consciousness seems so mysterious is because you need to do all of this work in little steps. You need to first understand what representation is, how it's in the brain, then understand this, then connect that to the next theory. And if you go step by step and build the theory up, then you get a satisfying result at the end. But if you just start and jump to the end and go, now how does that explain consciousness? Without going through the steps and thinking about the arguments that are presented, and just go, oh, well, I can imagine zombies, or there's more to consciousness, then of course it's going to seem like there's an explanatory gap. You haven't gone through the explanation. So, and that's not, again, to say that I think that this is right or that people I just think that it's not obviously false. And that that's good enough to do the work that we needed to do.
No, I do like that point of Uriah's, and I'm pretty happy with it. Of course, there are people like, for example, David Chalmers. He's a bright guy, and he can go through all of those steps. He sees all the steps, and it's very gripping for him to say, nonetheless, like it's not a fully sufficient explanation of consciousness. He can imagine all of those steps without any consciousness thereby arising.
Well, he certainly seems to be able to do that. That's right. Whether he actually is able to do that, I'm not sure. So I mean, we could leave that issue for another day, I suppose.
That's right.
Because we were just about to start talking about the misrepresentation and empty higher order.
Let's do it.
Yeah, so let me ask you a couple of questions about this, Pete, because you've written this paper, the unicorn paper. So you think that one of the defining marks of intentionality is its ability. I don't know if ability is the right word, but its aptitude for, I guess, representing things that are actually non-existent. And you think that that's maybe what we ought to call the problem of intentionality, and that bleeds over into our theories of consciousness, especially intentionally based ones, and presents serious problems. Is that right?
Yeah, I think that's pretty fair. And can I say a little bit more?
Yeah, please. Yes.
So I think that notions like consciousness and appearance and phenomenal in the old Kantian sense of phenomenal, and intentionality, aboutness, I think that they're made most vivid to us when we think about falsity and similarly inexistence or non-existence. So like it's a test of little kids' grasp of theory of mind that they can get false beliefs, and we grasp the notion of appearance best when we see the divergence of appearance and reality.
Yes.
If we were angelic beings from the get-go and only ever had true representations, I don't think we really have much use for notions like appearance and phenomenality and the way things seem.
Absolutely, yeah.
Right, and so even in intentionality, that there's this connection between the mind and the world, and the mind is one thing and the world is the other. That becomes most vivid to us when we contemplate things like falsity, the ability to believe that Santa Claus is coming. Right. So,
spoiler alert, right? There, not to ruin it for anyone, but there is no Santa.
There is no Santa.
That's right. Okay.
Right. So, hope no children are watching this.
Yeah. Right. Okay. Please continue, though.
Well, actually, that ended my follow-up about intentionality. Yeah, I think of that as like the problem of intentionality. I guess I would add one thing. I mean, probably a better way of thinking of the problem of intentionality is how to resolve this inconsistent triad
Right.
that many authors have thought about. So there are these three propositions that individually seem pretty plausible, but collectively are contradictory. And one way to put the three propositions is that one of them is that thinking about is a relation. So
Right.
that when I think about Brooklyn, that's some kind of relation between my thought and Brooklyn. The second proposition is that you can only enter into relations with relata that exist. So
Right.
I can only sit on a chair that actually exists, and I can only be next to a bookcase if the bookcase is actually there to be next to it.
Right.
And then the third proposition is that we can think about things that don't exist. So it's pretty clear that the three of these things can't be true all at once.
Right.
If thinking about is a relation, and I can only bear relations to things that exist, then I can't think about things that don't exist.
That's right.
So probably a better way to think of the problem of intentionality, a more broad way, and in a way that's more fair to the various positions about intentionality, is that it's the problem of resolving that triad.
Right.
And usually what people do is pick one of the three and say, well, that's the one I could most live without. And
Yes,
for my
that's
money,
right.
the one I can most live without is the one that says that consciousness is that intentionality or thinking about is a relation.
Right. Right. And so it's interesting. So you will end up denying that premise. I think it's fair to say that David Rosenthal ends up denying the idea that you can't have relationships to things that don't exist, whereas someone like me is going to end up denying that you can think about non-existent objects. So three different strategies for resolving that triad.
Yeah, that's
But before we,
interesting.
sorry.
I just wanted to signpost that maybe we can get to it later. I'm not convinced that Rosenthal would go along with that.
You're not. Oh well, that's something that we should discuss then. So
Yeah,
before
yeah.
we do that though, why don't you just continue a little bit more and say how this problem of intentionality translates into a problem? Well, let's be fair. I mean, let's try to be fair and say alleged problem for
Right,
higher
an
order
alleged problem.
for higher order approaches.
Certain persons have alleged.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. And I'm those persons.
Right, exactly. You are those persons.
I don't think anyone else likes the argument. So this is
I
my
know.
unique-
I don't think that's true. I think actually it's gaining some popularity amongst. It's got a cult following. But so why don't you say something about it first, though?
Excellent. Maybe I can have a festival at some point.
Yeah, right. The Unicorn Festival.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. So the unicorn argument says, okay, first off, let's look at the role that the notion of representation is playing in the higher order thought theory.
Right.
The higher order thought theory is trying to explain state consciousness. It's trying to explain how a mental state can be conscious in virtue of its being represented.
Right.
So one of my beliefs can change from being conscious to unconscious and back again, depending on whether there's some other mental state that is a representation of the belief.
Right.
And it's pretty easy to read that as depending on a representation relation. So
Right.
some first order state becomes conscious when there is some appropriate higher order state that bears the representation relation to it.
Right.
And so one
And
way
that's-
of stating...
I'm sorry. I was just going to support your claim by saying, in one way that this is inherent in Rosenthal's discussion about this stuff is he says that the higher order thought targets the first order state, and it's sort of implicit in that idea that there's a relationship between the two, one targeting the other.
That's right. Yeah, and
Right.
I believe that the etymology of intentionality has to do with pointing, intending,
Yes.
aiming, and it's very natural to read that as a kind of relation.
Right.
I mean, that's how it got into the triad, right. This is a very tempting view, but yeah, I do think it's pretty clear in a lot of expositions in the higher order thought theory that it's that the account of state consciousness is supposed to be a relational account. a state is conscious in virtue of a relation that it bears to a higher order thought. And then you ask the question, well, what is that relation? And it's the aboutness relation. The higher order
Right.
thought is about that target, and that's what makes that target conscious. And one way we
Right.
could summarize the view is that, in very simple terms, on the higher order thought theory, the state is conscious in virtue of being represented, where
Right.
being represented is this relational property. So the unicorn argument is so named because I don't think unicorns exist, so there's another spoiler for you. No Santa Claus, no unicorns, but just as we can think about zombies,
Right.
we can think about unicorns too, and you understand what I mean when I say unicorn. So we, to put this in terms of the triad, if we maintain that we are able to think about things that don't exist,
Right.
and we also maintain that you can only bear relations to things that do exist, then you're going to have to say that representing is not a relation.
Right.
It's. I mean, to be clear, it's not a relation to the thing represented. Maybe it's some other
Right.
kind of relation, like representing is just a certain kind of computational role. What makes my unicorn thought the thought that it is relations that it bears to other thoughts. So it might be relational in that kind of conceptual role sense, but it's not relational in a mind-world sense.
Right. Right.
So right, I do think we can represent things that don't exist, and that therefore representing can't be a relation. And this seems to me to spell doom for the higher thought theory. The higher thought theory is saying that a state's being conscious is it's being represented, and I think that there's no such property as being represented.
Right. And so no way that the property of being conscious could be identical to the property of being represented.
Yeah, I mean, I am assuming there is such a thing as being conscious.
Right.
Right.
Right. No, that's a good assumption.
So since there is such a thing, it can't be identical to something that doesn't exist.
Right.
There you go.
Right. And so you discuss a lot of the ways that people might respond to this argument. So I don't know. Would you want to say something about that, or would you want me to say a little bit about what I think Rosenthal's response might be?
Yeah. Why don't you go ahead and lay some more Rosenthal on us?
Yeah. Okay. So, well, first of all, I think we have to. I'm not sure if we have to, but it's important to note. I think Rosenthal thinks that all this talk about properties and relations is slumming a bit because of his real Quineanism that underlies a lot of his ideas about intentionality. So I think if it really push came to shove and it had to go to the mat, so to speak, I think he would just say property, what is that? Creature of darkness type stuff.
That's right.
But as long as you don't take that kind of talk too seriously, I think he's fine with using that language.
Right.
In fact, I mean, more than fine, he has used it in almost every paper he's written on this topic, where he says, this is state consciousness is a property of first order state. So, I mean, it's clearly he's okay with using this language. I don't know if he would ultimately resist because of these kind of dangers or not. But anyway, so I think that still talking in this way, he's going to end up arguing that it's just part and parcel of intentionality that we represent things that don't exist, and that oh, they found you, Pete.
Yeah, well, the doors are locked.
Okay.
I have weapons.
Okay. Sorry. So I think that he would just argue that it's part and parcel of intentional states and intentionality in general, that we can have representations of things that don't exist, and that we count as bearing relations to those things. So he likes to talk about, say he thinks he's thinking of a squirrel. The squirrel is brown. The squirrel has a fluffy tail. The squirrel is gnawing on something a squirrel would gnaw on, a seed or something. So he's thinking about this squirrel. I think it sounds natural to say he's thinking about this squirrel. There is no such squirrel. It's not a particular squirrel. And so you just end up saying, well, gee, you give a theory of intentionality. It turns out that you can have intentional states which are about things that don't exist, and those things have properties. And it makes sense to say that those things have properties, just like it makes sense to say his squirrel is brown or gnawing on a nut. So that it's and intuitions to the contrary, I think he would argue, stem from one's accepting a different theory of intentionality. So that one's intuitions about whether or not non existent objects can have properties really is a factor of which theory of intentionality one is sort of approaching the problem from. And that if one has this theory, namely a sort of Quinean theory about intentionality, or a Quinean / Shalarzian theory about, to be more specific, then it just becomes a prediction of the theory, nothing mysterious or surprising about it. And so then in these cases where you have higher order thoughts and no first order states, you nonetheless, there's an intentional object of the thought. That's the thought which figures as the content of the thought. And we can say that that thought, that first order state, has the property of being a conscious mental state, even though it's a notional state. And in just the way we can say that the squirrel is brown, even though it's a notional squirrel, which is bearing the property. So that's how I think I've heard him respond that way. I think that he would be, unless you really press this property talk, I think that would be, those would be the lines along which he would respond to the argument. So what do you make of that?
Well, I find a difficult time following it, and I'm not faulting you
first,
with this.
I think sorry. Before you start, would you agree that that's the kind of general response someone like him might give?
Yes, I do, and I think you've done a pretty nice job of presenting it. What I have a hard time keeping track of is the degrees of non-literalness.
Yeah.
So I think that the phrase was brought out that this is slumming it.
Right.
It's a kind of loose talk. We're going to engage in a certain kind of loose talk, and
right.
So it's loose talk to. It's a kind of loose talk that we say things like, well, right, the thought is about something. What's that? What's it about? It's about Santa Claus. But then when you start worrying about regimenting it, like you want to be Quinean, are you thereby committed to the following existentially quantified proposition that there exists an X such that X is Santa Claus and I'm thinking about it?
Right.
I think they want to say no. I mean,
they want to say
what part of slumming it didn't you understand?
Right? Yeah, right. Exactly.
Right. So, yeah. So then, right. So now I wonder, like, all these different concepts that seem very important to the higher thought theory, concepts like a thought.
Mm-hmm.
Is that slumming it too?
Right. Well, I mean, I don't want to put words in his mouth, but I think I can say a little bit that, it is slumming it, but only in the sense that the thought is a theoretical posit. So, I mean, someone like, David Rosenthal has, I guess he just doesn't think that introspection is a source of data for a theory. That's sort of a Quinean kind of thing there. It doesn't lead to theory, introspection. So you have this other kind of pathway that leads to the theory, and that's the third person stuff. So he views thoughts as theoretical posits that are aimed at explaining certain kinds of behaviors, namely people's utterances and various other kinds of behaviors. So I don't think that he thinks that it's slumming it per se, but they're definitely, you're committed to their existence only because you have a theory which sort of postulates them and nothing more. So is that slumming it? I don't know. So that's simply saying, well, in one way of speaking, these things are required.
Yeah, I interpret Quine as taking a pretty hard line on things like thoughts and beliefs, and I tend to read him as an eliminative materialist.
Right.
And so if you want to, it's useful for everyday life to talk about you as believing that there's beer in the fridge. But what's really going on? What really is? You've got certain brain states, and those are really just certain configurations of particles. And so physics and maybe some set theory, that's all there really is.
Right.
And now that's going to be shot through with theoretical posits. Microscopic particles are posits. We don't have direct experience of them, but they earn their keep in virtue of being able to do certain sorts of explanatory work. But as I read Quine, the ontology of folk psychology is screwed. That it really, it's you can posit it, but he's very pessimistic about that doing any real work in scientific theory. I gather that Rosenthal is much more optimistic, but I'm hesitant to. I think that this attribute these things to him. But
I know. I think we're speaking a little bit out of my depth of knowledge of attributing mental states to people like David Rosenthal.
But I'm inclined to think that for Rosenthal and other higher order thought theories that they're not eliminativists, that they really they do believe that there are such things as thoughts.
Right.
That's right.
This is exactly where, in my view, the Salarzianism of Rosenthal's view really steps in and does a lot of work. So this is the idea that, these postulating thoughts as theoretical entities does a lot of work explanatorily. They're not something that we can... So contra Quine, who thought, maybe we'll just get rid of them ultimately. I think that the Salarzian kind of idea, the myth of Jones, and the kinds of things that get people thinking along those lines has convinced David that, thoughts are really necessary in our theoretical apparatus. Now, I don't know, maybe I haven't really discussed these issues with him. If you pushed them towards a sort of churchlandish eliminativism whereby we get a later theory that just doesn't appeal to these things, I'm not sure what David's response is. I mean, my own view is that these things are just non-negotiable. We can't... We'll never. I'll never give up talking about beliefs, desires, thoughts, pains, itches, tickles, seeings of blue, etc. And people who say otherwise are just daft. I mean, sorry, no offense, but that's crazy talk. But I don't know. That's me.
It seems to me like a very important feature of thought is that it has content.
Right.
And so if you're gonna, or you or if one is gonna take thoughts very seriously, they need to think very seriously about content.
Absolutely.
And so it seems to me that part of that is that you can't be too cavalier about saying that you're slumming it when you talk about content, or that you're slumming it when you're talking about intentionality. And so I think it's fair then to ask for some precision about, what is intentionality and what is content and what's really going on when someone seems to be thinking about Santa Claus.
Yeah, and again, I think that the Salarzian idea that what's going on is that we're sort of positing these entities, thoughts that have contents, but that I mean, I can almost guarantee that he doesn't think that there are these things that have those contents. So he's not a fan of the compositionality kinds of arguments. So he starts from the other way. He starts with the whole sentence, and then an attribution of structure to the sentence is kind of guided by theorizing, but not really, we're not digging at the joints of the structure of the sentences. Now, so what's interesting is that for someone like me, I come from the other school. So even though I'm partial to the higher order approach, and I think it's valuable, my view about intentionality is much more inspired by the thinking of causal theorists, people like Kripke and Michael Devitt, than it is inspired by the Salarzian kind of Quinean view. So I'm much more apt to think that the relation of aboutness is really at bottom a causal historical relationship to objects in the world. And so that's why I would end up more inclined towards denying the one of the triad about thinking about non-existent thoughts and taking thought contents as compositional and building up sentences or thoughts or utterances from that compositional base. Now, what's interesting, I think, is that Rosenthal has always presented the higher order thought theory from his Quinean Schlarzian perspective, and you would expect him to do that. That's what he thinks is right, obviously. So that's his theoretical standpoint. But a lot of the theory survives translation into a more Kripkean / Devitt-inspired causal theory, and I think that's kind of an underappreciated area of work that could be done. Is sort of seeing which parts translate out and preserve the ideas, and which parts have to be kept there, or the theory sort of becomes non-viable.
So now, so you think that this causal relational stuff is going to save a higher order account from the unicorn?
I think it's a possible response. Yeah, it would be my preferred response. That's right.
But maybe this would be a nice time to segue into the empty higher order thought problem, which is a separate problem from the unicorn problem. Do you want to say some about what you think the empty higher order thought problem is, and what your favorite solution is?
Yeah, sure. So we've been talking about the mismatch problem a little bit earlier, which is the idea that you have a first order state with a certain content and a higher order state that doesn't match that first order content and what we say about that. And then we've been talking about the unicorn problem, which is the problem of trying to spell out, well, what exactly is or is it necessary that representation be a relation, and what role that plays in the higher order theory. So the empty higher order thought then is sort of a extrapolation / mix of a lot of these other ideas we've been talking about. It's the idea that even were there no first order state at all, and you just have the higher order thought, the theory predicts that phenomenologically there would be no difference. So a long time ago, someone postulated the idea of these three twins. I forget whose work is this?
I believe this is Karen Neander.
That's right, yeah.
But Alex Byrne also presses the empty higher order thought.
That's right. It's prevalent in the literature. So I think the three twins, though, really makes the point vivid. So if you imagine these three twins, each of which has the identical higher order state, one of them has the higher order state accurately representing the first order state. Call that the first twin. The second twin has a mismatch between higher order and first order content. The first order may be blue, the higher order may be red. So that's the second twin. Whereas the third twin has only the higher order thought and no first order state whatsoever. Now, we can generate the problem simply by asking, is there a difference between these three persons phenomenologically? And everything we've been discussing about the higher order theory leads us to say, no. Phenomenologically, these three people are the same. They could not tell just by sort of their experiential content which of these three states they were in. They would seem identical to them, even in the case where there was no first order state. Now, lots of people think that this empty higher order thought problem is sort of seriously fatal for the view, and it gives rise to this, well, what's going on here? How do we understand it? So recently, Ned Block has really been putting his finger, I think, on something which bothers people about this, which is that, well, when you have this higher order thought, you have an episode of phenomenal consciousness. That's follows from everything we've been discussing for the last hour. So there's something that it's like for you. It's like however the higher order thought says that it's like. If the higher order thought represents that you're seeing red, then by damn, it's like seeing red for you. And it's the exact same likeness phenomenally as the case where you're really seeing red. So we have an episode of phenomenal consciousness here, but that seems to present a counterexample to the theory, to the transitivity principle, since here's some consciousness hanging about, but there's no awareness of that consciousness. So how do we account for this the idea, this claim that we're supposed to make, that the higher order thought results in an episode of phenomenal consciousness? Now that's the problem as it strikes me and as it presses me. Is there something that you want to add to that?
Yeah, I would add that the problem seems especially problematic if you think that phenomenal consciousness, what its likeness, goes hand in hand with state consciousness. So in the empty higher order thought twin, what it's like to be that twin is just like being I guess they're triplets, right? If there's three of them.
Yeah. Well,
Anyway,
yeah.
the third triplet.
Triplet, right?
What it's like to be that triplet is the same across the three triplets, and
Right.
so it's very tempting to say that it has phenomenal consciousness. It's got the same
Right.
phenomenal consciousness as the other triplets. And if phenomenal consciousness goes along with state consciousness, and maybe even is the same as state consciousness, well, this is really weird because the third triplet was supposed to not have the state.
Right.
There is no state that the higher order thought targets.
That's right.
So
right.
it looks like we've got a blatant contradiction. As long as we're like gluing state consciousness and phenomenal consciousness together, the third triplet both is and isn't in this conscious state.
Right. So the theory seems to
bad.
predict. Yeah, that's bad. The theory seems to predict or seems to be indeterminate as to which value we're supposed to assign to this state. Now, I think so. I think this is an interesting problem, actually. Now, there's two ways you could respond to it. There's the way that Rosenthal responds to it, and then there's the way that I'm inclined to respond to it. So, David Rosenthal and his apprentice Darth Weisberg has defended a certain.
Richard,
Josh
can you hear me?
Weisberg, actually,
I just lost you.
Hello.
Oh boy.
Oh, the call was just dropped.
All right, so there's going to need to be some editing in this video. Just lost the phone connection. Let's see if we can get that back.
Oh, I'm recalling. This is going to have to be edited. Oh, the call failed again. Well, it's not my fault. I have perfect reception.
Hello?
Pete.
Hey, you're back.
Yeah, the call dropped for some reason.
Yeah, well, they warned us about using iPhones.
It's the only phone I have. I'm sorry.
Yeah, me too.
So, I mean, we should probably be wrapping this up at around this time anyway. So why don't we, if we want to finish this little last part of the discussion, then we can wrap it up?
That sounds good to me.
Okay, because I'm getting a low battery reading on my phone.
Oh, boy.
Well, we're at a point where we can succinctly put the problem
Sure.
or the solution. So
Yeah.
for someone like David Rosenthal, and his student Josh Weisberg, who I was referring to as Darth Weisberg jokingly earlier,
Former student.
Yes, that's right. His former apprentice. So the Weisberg-Rosenthal view seems to me to be to dig at the use of the phrase "what it's like" for one. So what they're concerned with is that someone has already inflated that phrase at the very beginning of the debate to the point where, this is. Are you still there?
Yeah, I'm still here.
Okay, well, something's beeping. Well, sorry, but they've inflated that phrase already to the point where no naturalistic explanation will ever be good enough. And so they argue, well, we need to deflate that phrase to the point where we can make sense of the idea that all there is to it is state consciousness. That seems to me to be a strategic error to talk about deflating it. So again, as my qualifial history would suggest, I take phenomenal consciousness seriously. And what this problem suggests to me is rather instead just that we should identify the episode of phenomenal consciousness with the higher order thought itself and distinguish phenomenal consciousness from state consciousness. So state consciousness goes to the target of the higher order thought, and phenomenal consciousness is identical to the higher order thought occurring itself. So that we clearly distinguish the two things. And then we have something we can argue about. Is that higher order thought the phenomenally conscious state or not? As opposed to this other thing, which seems to be non-productive, quibbling about, well, is this sense of what it's like really well defined or not? When obviously it's not meant to be well defined. It's supposed to be intuitively obvious from our own experience. So I would bifurcate at that point, and I think that that's the right. And then there are plenty of other arguments. Now, importantly, I just want to add before we end that I don't think that you get a view at the end that's any different than the original view that Rosenthal or Weisberg are defending. It's just that now you've taken phenomenal consciousness seriously as its own kind of entity
Yeah.
and identified it with one part of the theory. So I don't think that this is really like a new kind of higher order theory or some big advancement in like higher order theories. It's just, where do you put phenomenal consciousness if you take it seriously and you like higher order theories? Well, I say you put it here. You identify it with the higher order thought itself.
Would it be more accurate to say that you're identifying what it's like with the content of the higher order thoughts?
Well, I think that the specific, so this would have you introduce a distinction between, there being phenomenality in the first place and there being a specific way that it's like for you. So the specific phenomenality goes with the content of the hot. It determines what it's like. But that there is phenomenology in the first place is explained by the occurrence of an appropriate kind of higher order thought. So I would make that kind of distinction. But other than that, yeah, I'd agree.
Well, we've covered a lot of territory, actually.
Yeah, and we've sort of gone over target and had technical difficulties along the way. But what would philosophers be if not technically inept?
That's right. They would be lawyers.
We're merely... That's right.
Or scientists or something. Something useful.
We're merely honoring our roots going back to Thales, right? I'll fall in a well later today.
Yeah, me too.
Okay.
But I'll bring a guitar. We could, rock out in the same well.
Absolutely.
All right, man. Well, it was good to talk to you.
It was great talking with you. Very interesting discussion, and I'm excited.
I enjoyed that.
Okay, so I'll talk to you later.
All right, I'll see you soon.
Bye.
All right, bye-bye.